Yes, as I was saying, I was asked to talk about my early life, so that's what I will do. So let us begin at the beginning. I was born in Lancashire, in a Lancashire cotton town called Ashton-under-Lyne. And that was in 1943, and times were very different in 1943. My father worked in the aircraft industry. It was wartime, and my mother was a clerk in the civil service. We lived with my grandmother, little boy Heaven. She owned a candy store in a street called Penny Meadow. There wasn't much meadow to it in those days. The meadow was long past. It was one of the main shopping streets of the town, which was close to the very center of the town, the marketplace. The other stores in the street, many of them were occupied by young families, so I had plenty of friends to play with and get up to mischief and so on. And the shop was quite a social center, and especially on Saturdays when our relatives would do their shopping, and when that was done, they'd come and talk to my grandmother and my mother and stop in for a cup of tea. So we were quite a social center, and I had to get used to that, to disturbances to my researchers at an early age. At that time, the reason my parents lived with my grandmother was that Mr. Hitler had seen to it that there was not a lot of property on the market at that time. But despite this wartime destruction, there was a very positive mood in the population for the future. And particularly, people saw the future benefits that science would provide. And so from an early age, I was hooked on science, and I cannot remember a time when I did not want to grow up to be a scientist. They were the best. Times have changed. This is how we were in the 1940s. This is a painting by an artist called L.S. Lowry, who recorded scenes from the Lancashire Cotton Society. This painting probably sold at the time for a few £1,000s. It's now worth several million, I imagine. That's what his works go for. He originally worked in the next town to us, Oldham, but he painted scenes from our town as well. And latterly, he got a little bit of money and lived a little further out. People used to go and interview him from my school. So draw attention to a few things there. The smoky chimneys, which are a sign that a cotton mill is working. He was famous for what he called his stick men. And these are Lancashire people going about their business, and Lancashire people are noted for being very sociable. So that's a picture of a typical environment that I grew up in. So, as I mentioned, cotton was the basis of the 19th century prosperity of my town, and the landscape of my childhood was dominated by the mighty cotton mills. Here's one, the Imperial Cotton Mill, which I'm not quite sure where it was located, close to us. You see the chimney here. This whole building was driven by a single steam engine powered by coal, which was mined locally. We call coal black diamond. It has not such a nice reputation these days, but it powered these mills. One steam engine drove a series of belts which operated very, very noisy machinery. The cotton came into the town, imported through Liverpool from places like Galveston in America, and then it was spun and woven and exported around the world. Those cotton mills don't exist anymore. So this is a piece of history. I was very fortunate. My parents and my grandmother provided a loving and stable environment. It was a somewhat chaotic home because we didn't have much space. we all lived together in a single living room with a kitchen adjoining it. And the things which were going on there, constant stream of visitors, customers in the store, my father's singing lessons, singing scales, oh dear, not to mention my messing about with chemicals. And the family was very close, particularly on my mother's side. My grandmother was widowed when her children were in their teens, and she was left to bring up my mother and my uncle. My uncle Sid was a great influence on my development. He worked for the Admiralty in the war, and later he was a teacher. And he never seemed to tire of answering my questions. He was a lovely man. He played the piano. He wasn't terribly good at it, but I was listening to him play one time. I happened to be sick in bed, so all there was to do was listen to Uncle Sid on the piano. Again, I was hooked, and I demanded of my parents that I have piano lessons. Unfortunately, I'm not terribly good at it, but there's an old saying, isn't there? If a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing badly. My mother was a great walker. She was a woman of tremendous energy. I hope I have a little bit of it in me. I think I have. And she had a passion for walking. She loved the countryside. The Northern Mill times were quite small. Ashton was about 50,000 people, I think. So it was easy to escape from them, even by walking. And particularly on the eastern side of Lancashire, where Ashton was located, you could escape to the Pennines, which were covered in purple heather in the late summer. Further to the north, in the Lake District, we used to go on holidays there to a little farm called Skelgill. And this is a picture of Friars Crag in Derwentwater, which is where we went to after we climbed over Cat Bells to do some more walking. So, on to school and student days. I see my time ticking by. I was very fortunate in that I had very good teachers at my grammar school. They looked after me extremely well. But in parallel with my schoolwork, I also did my own activities. And here you see the terrible mess that is my worktop, where I was building a Geiger counter. Here is the counter. The Geiger tube is somewhere else. And you can see I was thoroughly involved in electronics and so on. In those days, it was valves. It was only later that transistors came onto the market. And then after school, I got a scholarship to Downing. Both my teacher and my physics teacher and my headmaster had been to Downing College, and they were very, very keen that I should also go to that college, to the point where the headmaster gave me personal tuition, and I was fortunate to get a scholarship to Downing. That was my room in Downing, where I lived for some years. So I was like a fish in water, a fish that had found water in Cambridge. It embodied everything I sought from a scientific life, full of ideas and characters, very beautiful buildings, surrounded by people, many of whom had brilliant minds. In the sciences, there was Martin Ryle, and he was using some of the early radio telescopes to debunk Fred Hoyle's picture of the static universe. And they used to have quite acrimonious debates about who was right, and it turned out that Ryle was right, the universe was expanding. Not only that, but there was Crick and Watson. They did their work in a little shed that looked like a bus shelter, which was overlooked by the office where I worked for my PhD, and much more. And then on the arts side, there was more music in Cambridge than you could possibly attend, and I particularly gloried in the organ music which provided in the college chapels. This was my new world. So, with that introduction, which has taken more longer than I intended, let me talk about some of the research which led to my obtaining this wonderful prize. And I hope to show that my work has its origins in very fundamental things, but that these fundamental things can lead on to practical things, which in turn can lead on to things which people actually want to buy because they're useful in their everyday lives. It's been a long story because some of this research that I'll show you is quite old. So there are some of the pictures which I'm going to show. So the first question I guess you would ask of me is, what is this metamaterial that we keep talking about? Quite simple to explain. So an ordinary material consists of atoms, and it's the properties of the atoms that ultimately determine how a piece of glass behaves. And you don't see the individual atoms. It's a sort of average over what each atom does. It's a very collective thing that you see in the response of glass. But the things which respond don't have to be as small as atoms. They just have to be smaller than the wavelength. And there's a lot of space between the size of an atom, which is, 10 to the minus 9, and a nanometer across or less, much less. There's a factor of 1,000 between that and the wavelength of light. So you can cram into that space objects which are big enough that you can actually manufacture them. Particularly if the wavelength is long. This is what we call a split ring, and its diameter is, in this case, it's just a few millimeters because it's designed to work with radiation of very long wavelength, typical of radar. Other metamaterials have much smaller structures these days as we get more clever with the engineering, but the basic idea is that the function of a metamaterial comes from engineered meta-atoms. Here's the first realization of that so-called split ring structure. One of the reasons the field took off was they were very, very easy to make. So if you're working at radar frequencies, which this is again designed for, then the whole size of this is maybe about 10 centimeters, and you don't even have to make it yourself. You design it on a computer and send it off to a company that manufactures printed circuit boards. And they will etch it for you into any shape or form you want. And so anybody could get in on the game if they had a computer and some design software. Here's another structure that was exploited the idea that you could have very, very unusual properties by having a metamaterial. So here's the rings, which are designed to have a magnetic response. There's some wires which you can only see as a slight shadow here as well, and they give an electrical response. And this was the first structure that realized a negative response to electricity and a negative response to magnetism, and that made something that had been sought for decades. Combined, they make a negative refractive index. In other words, they bend light the wrong way when it goes through the material. Here's another example. This is much later. This is a compound structure designed to do the same thing, only now at a much smaller length scale. Instead of being centimeters, this is microns, sub-micron structure, and this is designed to work in the infrared. It works by Zhang Zhang's group in California. Well, what is this negative refraction? A guy called Veselago, a Russian guy who died only recently, actually, published a paper in about 1960 that said that if you could have a material with negative refraction, it would have all sorts of crazy properties. So if you have normal refraction, then the array of light would come this side of the normal here, and there's a formula which actually relates these angles to the index of refraction of a medium. But this negative refraction bends the light back on itself, And for that reason, it creates very strange properties. Without going into too much detail, here's one of them, that if you make a little pulse of light and send it through the medium, then the way the pulse travels is the opposite to the way the wave travels. So imagine that you've got these waves, and there's an envelope here, and the envelope's going this way, and the waves are wriggling through like that, trying to get out of the back of the envelope. Very, very strange stuff. Now, when you have a metamaterial with countless degrees of freedom, you've got to have some way of controlling them. How do you design things? And in this, we turn to this gentleman, who is well known to all of you, I'm sure. And he had this theory that light can be bent by a star. Of course, Einstein said that space isn't empty. In the 19th century, scientists thought of words for space that were basically saying nothing, vacuum, nothing. But Einstein said, no, it isn't nothing. It's in many ways just like an ordinary material. It has properties like, for example, it's got a metric which essentially, as far as light is concerned, describes a refractive index. Space has a refractive index, and you can change it. You can change it by putting something very heavy near it. And one of the first experiments that proved Einstein right was this experiment in which the deflection of starlight by the sun, observed during an eclipse, so otherwise you can't see the star, this deflection agreed with the prediction of Einstein's theory. And we're going to use that idea of Einstein's that space is made of rubber to have a new design paradigm. This is another illustration from the Hubble telescope. So this shows a red galaxy in the foreground, and behind this is a blue galaxy. If the red star wasn't there, you'd see a blue dot. But because it is there, it refracts the light around it, just like a lens made of glasswood. So space has a refractive index, and Einstein was right. And that leads on to what we call transformation optics. So we imagine that if we want to control a ray of light, we imagine it's embedded in a rubber sheet, ordinary space rubber. And then to push the ray where we want it to go, we take hold of the space, and remembering that you can change it like a piece of rubber, we stretch it and pull it until the ray, which is embedded in the space, moves with the rubber and goes to where you want it to be. So where you pull the rubber, the ray moves. If you don't distort the rubber in its vicinity, the ray stays where it is. And that's going to be very important when we come to designing a cloak. So one of the things which caused some consternation was when we announced that we could design a cloak of invisibility. Now, this illustrates the challenge of designing a cloak. So most stealth technology relies on the fact that the object doesn't reflect light. And that can be quite useful. It's a feature of many modern aircraft in fighters and bombers and so on. But black is not enough, because even if something's black, it has a shadow. Now, some of you will have heard of Peter Pan, and Peter Pan was a little boy who lost his shadow. And when Peter has lost his shadow, he's not only black, but he is invisible. So how do we make a shadow disappear? Well, here's a story. You employ transformation optics. So the idea is that you mustn't touch what happens in this inner sphere here. So you mustn't distort anything here, and you mustn't distort where the rays go outside here, because if the rays don't go where they would have done if there was nothing there, you know there was something there. And so you're only allowed to mess with the stuff here. So I'm going to take this bit of rubber, which is space, here, and I'm going to stretch it and pull it until all the rays of light are expelled from the inner region and are all concentrated in the cloak. But I am not going to do any stretching and pulling here. Now, you might think that it's a huge challenge to design something which sends these rays on a trajectory that come out exactly as they would had nothing been there. And it is, unless you have this technology of transformation optics. And that enabled us very easily to design a cloak. You could indeed write down the formula for the cloak. And it proved a great sales pitch for metamaterials and transformation optics, because people said if you could solve this apparently very, very difficult problem so simply, maybe these things could solve simple problems very easily, and so it proved. I'll move on to discuss negative refraction, because this is another idea which caused a bit of a storm. Veselago already knew that if you could bend light the wrong way as it entered negative refracting medium, inevitably it would come to a focus here. So here's the rays, they bend the wrong way, and they come to a focus. And by the way, they come to a second focus here. And he knew that his negative refracting material could make a lens. The only problem was that at the time he wrote the paper, that there was no such material, and that situation continued until metamaterials came along. And, okay, now, I alluded to a rainy Sunday morning in my little talk I gave earlier with the video you saw. And on that rainy Sunday morning, what I was thinking about was this lens. And I realized that a very old law called Abbey's law wasn't true. And the law says that with an ordinary microscope, you can't see anything smaller than the wavelength of light, which is about 1/2 millionth of a meter. And that may seem very small, but that's just the size at which cells start to be interesting. You can't see inside a cell with an ordinary microscope because it can't resolve what's in there. And so this was thought to be an ironcast law, except that on that rainy Sunday morning, I realized that there was more to Veselago's lens than had been realized, that if you made it in the right way, it was perfect. It could be perfect. But there's the catch. You have to make it in the right way. Here's an approximation to it. This, again, is in the Zhang laboratory in Berkeley. And they made an approximation to the lens out of a piece of silver. So there's a lens. There's a spacer there. And there's the thing they're looking at, which is a bit of chromium. And since things are too small to see with a microscope, you actually have to write them in essentially a bit of photographic film, which we call a photoresist. So you send the light in here. It's got 365 nanometers wavelength, and you're trying to see something which is a few tens of nanometers across. So how are you doing? Well, here's an image of the grating, and you can see that although the structure of the grating is on a scale of few 60 nanometers or so, you can resolve it with this technique. More impressive is this figure here, where you're looking at the word nano in the chromium. There's a 2-micron scale. This is what you see if you don't see any lens, have any lens. And then, if you put the silver lens in place, it's like putting your spectacles on. All comes into focus. And this is a scan across, which shows that you have, in fact, improved the resolution from what would have been about 320 nanometers, which is what you see here, to 90 nanometers. Okay, not perfect, but a lot better. Now, in the time remaining to me, I want to show you how these ideas which spring from Einstein and Maxwell's equations and so on, and in which we've had some playful experiments which were really demonstrators of the theory and not designed for practical things at that stage, but showed that practical things could be done. And I just want to spend the remaining time whizzing through some of the many applications which metamaterials have spawned. So here's one early one, and what you're doing here is this remote controlled vehicle which has to communicate with a satellite. And the conventional way of doing that is having a satellite dish, which is heavy, has to be steerable to follow the satellite. Far better to have what's called a phased array, which is normally very expensive because it's full of transistors, but this phased array is made out of metamaterials. Turns out you can very easily change the property of a metamaterial, and that enables this, without it physically moving, to point at any part of the sky you want. And this is being developed by Echodyne. They're also developing this same technology to ease your passage through airports. Now you have to have a terahertz scan. You go in this thing and things whiz around, complete nuisance. With their technology, you can walk past the machine, and as you walk, you'll be scanned, stopped if there's anything wrong, but free to proceed if not. It's also been applied to MRI. This is my colleague, Richard Sims. He's developing technology to improve the speed of MRI scanning. So magnetic resonance imaging, the signal is a magnetic resonance, a beautiful, pure magnetic field, which in present technology, we promptly turn into an electrical signal, which then has to make its way through a very noisy environment. Richard's idea is to keep the magnetism and design not a conventional wire which conducts electrons, but a wire which conducts magnetism, and that keeps the signal pure. You can have lower noise levels. The scan doesn't take 20 minutes, it takes 2 minutes or so, and you can do more scans. So that's one useful thing you can do with metamaterials. This is another. This actually generates the terahertz radiation, which you would use in that scanning technology I showed. And what you're doing here is you're taking a device which generates terahertz waves, but isn't very good at sending them out to you. And on top of it, you pile a metamaterial structure, which is very good at extracting the power from that device. This is from the Capasso group in Harvard. Another favorite of the Harvard group is they're making lenses which are extremely thin. So this isn't a split ring, but it's a sort of semi-split ring. These are little resonators which are very much sub-wavelength. And you can see they change their orientation and the shape. And the idea of that is it's like changing the refractive index of a lens. The difference to an ordinary lens is that this lens can be just a few nanometers thick. So you can make very, very, very thin lenses using metamaterials. What else? Yes, I thought I'd show this one. Kymeta, another company that manufactures metamaterials, they put satellite communications dishes on top of some of the Toyota's cars. I don't know where that's got to these days, but this car was driven from, I think, Los Angeles to Michigan, and Toyota headquarters were in contact with it the whole time. And the idea is that one day your car will have antennae like this on the top, and they will continuously be in contact with whoever. Whether you like that idea or not is a good question. And on and on. This is a panel which is designed to control not electromagnetic waves, not light, but it's designed to control sound. Sound is a wave, so metamaterials control almost any sort of wave you like. And this panel is full of little resonators. You can't see them properly, but they are there. And the idea is that this panel stops sound and is sold by a Bristol company, which the idea is that you can use it in a hospital to make a silent zone around a the bed of a very sick patient. This is also being developed by Nissan, and the idea here is to use these metamaterial resonators to control the road noise in a car. The major source of noise from a car traveling at speed on the motorway is road noise, and metamaterials can help there. Finally, something really way out, one of my former postdocs, Sebastian, had the idea that another sort of wave is an earthquake. It's really a wave, and if you can deflect it away from really sensitive objects like nuclear power stations, then that might be something useful. And this is a very sort of crude metamaterial. It's made by drilling holes in the ground. So here you can just about see these holes in the ground. And it's not a cloak at this stage, but the idea is to see if this structure alters the way that waves move through the earth. And there he's persuaded an oil company to lend him this thumper truck. Here's a heavy weight, which is going to be hoisted up here and then come down like that, thump on the ground, and send waves out. And then they ask the question, does this structure send those waves where we're trying to send them? And the answer is yes, and it's published here in Physical Review Letters. So I'm afraid I don't have time to explain this slide in detail, so let me just talk around it. What next for metamaterials? Metamaterials are structured in space, and that's what gives them their unique properties. But there's another dimension, and that's the dimension of time. So if you can change something in time very, very rapidly and keep on doing that to shake something. So imagine that you have some sort of modulation of, say, the refractive index, and that will affect the way light moves. But if you can also make that modulation move, that will do something very different. Now, the key thing about that is if you start mucking about with time, you break a very, very strict law which holds for things which don't vary in time. And that is, if things don't vary in time, the equations of physics are reversible in time. So you can send things forward and backwards. And that's both an advantage and disadvantage. It implies energy conservation. But if things change in time, that's broken. It's no longer a law. You may have other laws, but you lack that one of energy. And you can make structures like this, which will take an ordinary plane wave, squeeze it, put energy into it. And in London, we're exploring the possibilities of these crystals in time, which will do even more extraordinary things than regular metamaterials. So with that, I thank you for attention, and I leave you with my conclusions, as I'm already over time. So thank you.